With that, I'd like to introduce Greg Cassidy. So I met Greg on New Tracks. He's one of the regulars on New Tracks and helps and does a number of things, including running what's called the My Build, which is a monthly time where modelers show what they've been building in their models. And Greg's always impressed me. He's an amazing modeler. The thing he does, he's in an interesting position because being in the East, he's around a lot of the small manufacturers and has developed quite a both reputation and a business building kits for manufacturers. So, a lot of manufacturers, when you see their display models they have on their tables, Greg's actually the guy that's built a number of those. So, and he also does some amazing Halloween displays. So it's not just model railroading; it's other things. And Greg did this clinic on paintbrushes, and I've always found paintbrushes to be quite mysterious because I know I can walk into my local Michaels and buy a packet of 12 brushes for 9.99 with 20% off for $8. So the average cost of a brush is $6. But when I go to Blick, I see brushes that cost $20. And I have no idea about what the difference is in either use or in outcomes of why I would want to buy a $20 brush versus a 60-cent brush and whether it's going to matter at all in my models. And I thought Greg did a great job of kind of going through the basics of kind of paint and brushes. And so with that, I'm going to throw it over to Greg and let him inform us about brushes and what brushes are good for which kind of jobs and roles in model railroading. So Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. You're very kind. And I will admit that the more I did research on brushes, the more I found out how little I know and how little I still know about them. There's so much to them that comes from outside the modeling world. Paintbrushes have been used going back to the great artists centuries ago. So what I found out was primarily what I needed to know to do my type of modeling. And I'll share that with you now. And if anyone has any questions or any information as I'm going along, feel free to just break in. You should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, all good.
Great. All right. Well, welcome to my clinic about paintbrushes. We'll be going over what brush options there are and how to care for them. I first gave this clinic on the New Tracks modeling show last month, and I was a little constrained on time then, so it's not a very long clinic, but at least I don't have to rush through it like I did then. I used to teach a course in community college about electronic page imposition for printing, but my students had to know how a bindery department worked before they could learn how to impose pages to be printed. So we spent the first week learning about bindery. We'll be doing the same here, so before we go into brushes, we'll cover a couple other subjects. The first is paint. What kind of paint will you be using? That can very much determine your brush choices. We can broadly classify paints into two types, water-based and solvent-based. All paints consist of at least three parts. Pigments, these are the finely ground particles that do not dissolve but are suspended in the paint. There are two types of pigments, prime pigments and extender pigments. Prime pigments are those that contribute to both wet and dry color in a paint. Extender pigments are lower cost pigments that give extra weight or bulk to the paint. Binders. These are ingredients that provide a binding effect that holds the pigments together to create a dry film on the surface. A paint's binder is the key ingredient that directly relates to a paint's performance, including adhesion, washability, fade resistance, or gloss retention. You can have oil-based binders and acrylic binders. The vehicle. This is the transport for the mix of the pigments and binders to travel from the bottle to your subject and then evaporate. These types of liquids differ depending on the type of paint. For oil-based and alkyd paints, the liquid is typically paint thinner or some other type of solvent. For acrylic paints, the liquid is usually, but not always, water. and additives. Some paints have additives for specific properties the manufacturer wants a paint to have. This applies less to model paint than some other types of paints. Paint is a liquid mixture of pigment and solvent. When dry, it forms a film-like layer. You can see here the ratios of the components of paint made up of pigments, binders, liquids, and additives. On the left is solvent paint, usually a half and half ratio. Waterborne paint on the right is made up of more vehicle and less pigment. Water-based acrylic paints have a water vehicle and both thin and clean up with water. Water-based acrylic paints are the most popular type of paint used by modelers nowadays. These paints are non-toxic, odorless, and dry very quickly, so you don't have to wait a long time between coats. There are painting techniques that are easier to do with acrylics, such as dry brushing. When using these paints, you can wash your brushes in water, so you don't need any special thinners to clean them with. Solvent-based acrylic paints. Several manufacturers of acrylic paint for modelers use an alcohol base or an acetone base instead of a water base. True Color and some Tamiya paints fall into these categories. As these solvents evaporate faster than water, these paints dry even quicker than water-based acrylics. The downside is that these paints are generally thinner, so give less coverage, and the solvent in the fresh paint can damage paint underneath that is not fully cured. But they do spray very nicely. Enamel paints were first designed for model kits and figures, making them a classic choice for hobbyists. These paints use an alkyd binder and acrylic resin to create a solvent with a petroleum base. Enamel paints have a strong vapor and smell, similar to lacquer paints. You'll want to use them in a well-ventilated area. Enamel paints are the longest drying paint of all these options. The enamel uses a unique curing process to create a chemical change, ensuring the paint dries into a durable, hard shell compared to other paint finishes. For decades, flocal paints were a fixture of model railroading. They were the only paints many used from the 60s until their virtual demise when the original formula was discontinued. To say the loss of flocal was significant to scale modeling would be an understatement. Because flocal had such unique qualities, it factored into many of the choices of how we went about constructing a model, mainly because it was durable and stuck to what you applied it to. You never had to worry about any type of masking material pulling it up, and it was impervious to all decal setting solutions. But for all its great qualities, flocal had its own set of issues. At the top of the list was the health hazard of inhaling the fumes. The main component in flocal was an organic compound known as xylene. Xylene was responsible for the characteristic smell of flocal. Xylene was also a small component of lacquer thinners of the day, and while you could thin flocal with lacquer thinner, the other components in lacquer thinner typically degraded the quality of the paint and ruined the shelf life, so you always wanted to thin with diasol. When painting with flocal, it was essential for your health to work with extremely good ventilation. Polyscale. Tester Corporation announced in May 2013 that it would discontinue its Polyscale paint line, including its water-based acrylic paints, due to a changing modeling market. However, Tester continued to take orders from retailers and ship paint for a limited time. This paint is made with finely ground pigment and dries to a durable finish on plastic, resin, wood, and metal models. It can be brushed or airbrushed without obscuring surface details. Scale Coat 1 and Scale Coat 2 are specialized paints designed for use on different surfaces. Scale Coat 1 is formulated for use on brass, metal, and wood, while Scale Coat 2 is created specifically for plastic. Both paints dry to a high gloss finish, which allows decals to be applied directly without the need for a barrier. Scale Coat paints were available in both bottles and spray cans. Iron Horse Model Works is the new owner of Scale Coat. On their Facebook page, they say, "We are now the new home of Scale Coat model paint. The paint line will still be called Scale Coat, and nothing will change with the formulas of the paint." Oil paints. Oils and their less understood water-soluble cousins gouache are not a typical paint in modeling, but can be used for very effective weathering, rusting, and streaking. They can be simply applied and then streaked or spread around using mineral spirits, or plain water in the case of gouache. Washes can be made in their simplest form, but there are many specialized ones on the market. Again, these are primarily used for weathering, and in some cases just darkening a paint so it isn't quite as bright. Some are water-based and others are solvent-based, so be sure you know what you're getting and how to use it. Second, what material are you going to be painting on? Some materials like brushes, and some are better being sprayed. By sprayed, I mean either with an airbrush or a rattle can. Plastics. You want to wash them first to get off mold release. You should prime it first if using a brush. Spraying them often works better, but they can be brush painted. This largely depends on if you're painting a small detail or a whole boxcar or a building. Wood. This material loves to be brush painted. You can stain the wood before painting or afterward, or both. You don't need to prime unless you're painting a G-scale structure to be placed outside all year. Then treat it like you would if painting your house. Sometimes priming a wooden structure before painting it can lose some of the wood grain that is one of the calling cards of a wooden structure. Metal. Again, size can matter. For larger items such as a locomotive or a caboose, you'll want to prime and spray most likely. Smaller details like soft metal castings can be brush painted, but should be washed and primed first. Hydrocal. This is very absorbent and will take paints and stains well using a brush. Also, items such as Copic markers work very well with hydrocal. And resin. It can be similar to plastic, but is not the same. For small 3D painted items, wash and prime them first, and you can brush paint them very nicely. But for cast resin, it should be washed and primed, and it may be better being sprayed than brush painted. It really depends on the size and the detail. Okay, now we've made it to brushes. First and foremost, you need to choose the right brush for the job. The size and shape of the brush will depend on the size and shape of the area you want to paint, and also on the material sometimes. For small details and intricate parts, a fine-tipped brush such as an O or double O is ideal. The smallest brush that I regularly use is a Winsor & Newton 4O. For larger items, a flat brush or a round brush with a bigger tip is more appropriate. For brush shapes, paintbrushes come in many different shapes and sizes. The shapes and sizes of the brushes you choose to work with will depend mainly on how large an item you want to work on, how detailed you want to get, and very often the type of paint that you're using. Flat shapes are great for covering large areas with paint. A few of the most common brushes in the flat family are flat shaders, filbert, angular shaders, and stroke brushes. Round brushes are my most common brush to paint with. Smaller ones are perfect for detail work, and larger ones for general coverage. They come in various shapes and sizes such as round, linear, and mop. And I'll add that when I'm applying stain, either a round brush or a flat brush will work depending on the area that I'm planning to cover. Specialty shapes are used for varying techniques. Brushes such as fan shape, dry brush, and stippling are just some of them. And there are some ultra specialty brushes on the market. There are many specialized brushes, such as these shown here. These are sold in nail salons for doing fingernail art. They also work well for eyes or bridles or any other fine detail work. Natural versus synthetic. Natural hairs are generally used for oil paint and watercolor paints and are more expensive. Synthetic brushes usually work better with acrylics. Depending on the quality of the hair used in natural brushes, they can be prone to damage and do not work as well with acrylic paint because the pH of acrylic paint is the opposite to that of the natural hairs. Synthetic brushes are cheaper and more durable than natural hair brushes. There are different qualities of synthetic hair. I like synthetic brushes from manufacturers such as Royal & Langnickel, Winsor & Newton, AK, and Army Painter. But I have a bunch of craft store brushes as well. One test to see if your brushes can hold their shape is to wet them and bend the ends. See on the right how some have popped right back up and others will stay bent until they're dry. I use those for applying stains where holding its shape doesn't usually matter. But a brush holding its shape can be a true testament to how good it's holding up. And usually you'll want one that can hold its shape if you're doing any fine detail work. It's important to have a range of sizes and shapes of brushes. Here you can see I have my Winsor & Newton 4.0 brushes for fine detail, some Army Painter dry brushes, some OK Craftsmart brushes for general use, some very nice Royal & Langnickel for better use, some really nice AK for really nice detail work, some really cheap craft store brushes for when it doesn't matter, and a mixed lot of really good to so-so brushes that I've collected over the years. When applying paint to your model, sometimes it can work better to use thin coats and build up the color gradually. This will help you achieve a more even finish and avoid any unsightly brush marks or streaks. It's also important to avoid applying too much pressure on the brush, as this can cause the paint to go on too thick and result in an uneven finish. And again, this will depend on the thickness or viscosity of the paint that you're working with. Thinning your paint with water or a paint thinner can help you achieve a smoother finish. It also allows the paint to flow better, making it easier to apply with a brush. Be careful not to over-thin your paint, as this can affect the color and the coverage. I like liquid flow aid. Water sometimes has too much surface tension. You can also see I like to use coffee lids for my palette. They're free and easy to throw away once they're completely covered. If every time you wash a brush, you leave a little bit of paint at the base of the bristles in that hard-to-reach bit near the ferrule, it'll gradually accumulate as dry paint, stiffen, and force the hairs apart. It's tedious to ensure all the paint is washed out thoroughly at the end of every painting session, but try to, because it'll really make your brushes last longer. I used to use a small bowl with a brush puck for rinsing, but I started using a rinse well, which I really like. Whatever you use, have it nearby and easy to keep clean water in. Having a sink near your workbench is handy as well. I'll often use Master's brush cleaner or Winsor & Newton cleaner, especially if I've loaded a lot of paint onto my brush. Sometimes that Winsor & Newton cleaner can get stuff out of a brush that I swore I had cleaned thoroughly. I don't know how it does it. Using soap and water, you can also clean your brushes. It's better than nothing. The tip of the handle is sturdier than the tip of the bristles. So if you want to store your brushes upright, put them into a container standing on their handles, not the bristles. And never leave your brush soaking brush down in anything. Try using a wet palette someday. It's a great tool for keeping your paint moist and workable, especially if you're mixing colors. It also helps to thin out your paint, making it easier to apply with a brush. You can either buy a wet palette, or you can make one yourself by placing a wet paper towel in a Tupperware and covering it with a piece of parchment paper. I use it most of the time when painting figures to get shading. And the beauty of having one that you can cover is if you've mixed a couple of colors together, but you're not finished using that mixture, it can keep it moist and you can sometimes get a couple of days out of it. Alternates to brushes. Copic markers are a brand of alcohol-based refillable markers with a fine and a broad brush at either end. An oil brusher is a modeling product made by Amomig that contains oil paint that's diluted to the right consistency and comes in a bottle with a brush attached to the cap. You can layer and thin these with mineral spirits, and they're excellent for weathering and rusting and streaking. A microbrush is a single-use tool with a small tip that can be used for precise application in a variety of settings. So what is the best paintbrush for modeling? Well, all of these. It's really about picking the right tool for the right job and keeping it in good shape. And that's the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions.
Just one.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I found Vallejo makes a brush restorer that is an excellent product for using the acrylics.
Really, I'll have to look into some of that. I use a lot of Vallejo paint and some of their other texture products, but I haven't tried their brush restorer. It wouldn't hurt to keep some on hand. I could have used it years ago before I was actually doing the strict regime that I do nowadays with my brush cleaning. My brushes last a lot longer nowadays than they used to, but having a brush restorer on hand couldn't hurt.
Let's see, am I talking successfully here?
Yes.
Mr. Cassidy, I am the inheritor of a scrounge set of brushes. My wife's mother passed away and was a crafter, and so I have this whole collection of scrounge. I own no brushes of any stature whatsoever, and I have been trying to use them, and pretty much I start to use it and there's stray fibers and stuff. I just pitch it over my shoulder and keep going. But the thing that is plaguing me the most is I'm doing, let's say I have an O scale caboose and I'm painting the underbody to get rid of the fact it's all bright red plastic. So I'm painting a lot, and the acrylic close to the ferrule starts to set up. Now, there's this thing where you have water and there's the nubs in the bottom. Is it to leave, if I'm not going to use a brush for a bit, just let it sit in the, it's suspended so it's not resting on the fibers?
Right.
Is that a valid way?
Similar to that. It has a spring on the top and holds them brushed down in water. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with leaving it sit in that. Two answers. The first, when you first are getting the paint on your brush, as much as you can avoid it, you want to avoid getting up into the ferrule area because that's where it's so hard to get out of. Plus, as you're brushing on your model, whatever the surface is, that paint isn't going to get wicked up or sucked up and actually used. So it almost has a detrimental effect to the whole operation because it's not helping you in your painting, and it's going to be harder to get out of there, especially if it starts to dry, as you say. Right. So as much as you can, try to keep the paint on the end of the brush, but don't load the paint on so much that it gets up into the ferrule.
Okay.
And as far as the brushes that you've inherited, You might have some good brushes in there. Ones that start to have stray hairs, I have a little pair of scissors, and if I have a brush that's still mostly usable, but a couple of strands have gone stray, I'll just clip them off.
Right.
Something else you can do, that Masters brush cleaner that I showed, it's almost like a very thin paste. And if you get your brush wet and rub it around in that, the paste adheres itself to the brush, and you can actually use your fingers to shape the brush and then don't wash the stuff off, and it'll hold the brush in that shape. And the next time you go to use it, you want to wash that stuff off before you use it, but very often you might find that it's actually repaired the brush. And this brush restorer that Ken remarked on might be worth a try as well.
Okay. One other question regarding wicking of the paint.
Mhm.
Somehow I have it in my pointed little head that if I start off when I'm getting ready to go, I wet the brush with water first, shake it off, squeeze it out, and then there's water wicked up near the ferrule to discourage the paint from wicking up there. Is that a valid approach?
It'll probably depend on the paint you're using and how you get the paint on the brush. If you're doing that and you're working with a somewhat thicker acrylic, if you just get it on the end of your brush, it's unlikely that very much of it is going to actually wick up into that water.
Okay.
If you're working with a thinner paint, it's probably more likely for that to happen. But on the other hand, if it's a thinner paint, it'll probably be easier to get it out of there.
All right. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Any other questions?
Any other questions or comments?
Well, I want to thank you all for listening today. As I said, the more I researched brushes, the more I found out I don't know. And after my first clinic, I had a little bit more feedback that's sent me in another direction of finding out information about what's actually left when the paint dries or hardens or coalesces. And some of this goes back to if you're using an acrylic paint, once you're cleaning your brush, what's going down the drain is whatever vehicle was part of the paint, but also the pigments and the binders, which very often turn out to be microplastics in many senses. And in modeling, it's not really a big issue, but this was a discussion about interior house painting. And they did mention that if you have a septic tank type field or something and you wash out a lot of brushes, you could be putting a lot of plastic down the drain. Now, they didn't get into solvent paints or oil paints, but that's something that I've been spending more time looking into, is what's left over once the paint has cured. What is it that's on the surface? If it's an enamel paint, obviously it's enamel left on the surface, which can be a very hard coating. If it's an acrylic, it's the binder is really what's left holding the pigment on the surface. And those binders, the formula for those is specific for each paint manufacturer, and it's hard to find out what it actually is. You will find some are more flexible than others. If you remember, there was a line called Model Flex that was out a number of years ago that proclaimed they had a little bit of flexibility in their binder, so it was less likely to show a crack if something moved. So that's my next area of research. And if I ever come up with anything usable on that, I'll let Phil know.
On Model Flex, I'm currently using Badger Model Flex. I don't know if that's the same Model Flex that you're referring to, though.
I think Badger bought it. It went through two permeations. It was AccuFlex and Model Flex, and I think Model Flex was first and AccuFlex was second, and I don't know if that's about the time Badger bought it.
Okay.
I don't see it much around here anymore. Some of the names like Vallejo and Mission Models have kind of pushed them out of the hobby shops around here. But But I still have quite a few bottles of my old AccuFlex and ModelFlex downstairs that I dip into every now and then if I can open the bottle.
Current production has a nice flip top, plastic flip
Really?
top that seems to seal well and allows very good portion control when you're putting, putting drops in to get a mix or something.
Okay.
I used Flowquill 20, 30 years ago, but yeah, the solvents never thrilled me to death. So I'm happy to go to acrylics, even though Phil and others here may remember a presentation that was done for us by a gentleman talking about painting, and he had a lot of experience with Flowquill, and we mentioned acrylics, and he just went, "Oh no, they're no good. You can't use acrylics." And we just sort of looked at him politely and goes, "Okay, sir." It just.
I am very familiar with that attitude, and in a sense, they're right. The shift over to acrylics was fraught with many trials, tribulations, and hardships coming from solvent-based paints, whether it was Flowquill or Polyscale or Scale Coat. And in their early stages, the acrylics were difficult to get to do what you wanted them to do.
Mm-hmm.
They're much better now. I think we can thank the military modelers and the role-playing game painters for that, because they've really driven the market of acrylic paints. And that's helped us all. And I think many of us have seen how you can learn so much from the military modelers and the role-playing modelers in their painting. And something that was a discussion in a previous show was our hobby. We have two segments of it. We have the model railroading part where we're playing with trains, running trains, building layout stuff. And then we have the modeling aspect of it where we're building stuff, which includes painting stuff. And many of us can fall somewhere on a scale between modelers and model railroaders. Military modelers and role-playing modelers, they don't have the playing with trains part of it. All of their hobby revolves around building and painting. So that's their whole focus. And that's, I think, why they've driven the art of painting and airbrushing. They've done so many things with airbrushing and weathering, such as dry brushing and stuff, that all of us modelers can benefit from. But they live in a world of acrylics. You'll never see any of them going back to something like Flowquill or Scale Coat.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again, thank you, Phil, for inviting.
Absolutely, Greg. I think the one thing that we all need to recognize, I remember back in about 81, the auto industry went from basically spraying lacquer paints to having to use water-based paints, because what happened was there was so much emission from the factories from the paint curing that I know, for example, the Bay Area, with the Bay Area emissions, you could not spray lacquer paint anymore, because you were just basically, all the solvents you were spraying were going into the atmosphere. And so kind of uniformly, the whole auto industry had to go to water-based paints. And if you remember some of those early 80s cars where after about 10 or 15 years, all the paint started peeling on the top of the car, and that was because the water-based paint. So there was a huge, and water-based paints are by definition acrylics, right? So there was a huge amount of research in making acrylic paints more stable and longer lasting in the auto industry. And I think a lot of that carried over into other acrylic paints, and is why the acrylic paints of today are profoundly different. It wasn't just the modeling that changed it. It was that whole auto industry and going to water-based paints that made a major change, that you had to make water-based paints that were essentially equivalent when being sprayed on a car to the lacquer paints you had back in the 70s or before the 80s. So yeah, it's interesting. I think acrylic paints of today versus acrylic paints of 40 years ago are profoundly different things.
We had a 1987 minivan that within about 10 years lost all the paint off its little hood.
Yep. No, exactly. And that, again, they really worked very hard in the auto industry to resolve that set of issues. So, anyway, so thanks, Greg. Really appreciate it. Absolutely a super introduction and kind of coverage of paintbrushes. It's for all of us modelers. I know we all probably have 2 or 3 cans with paintbrushes sitting in them, and hopefully now we'll take the time to sort them out and think about which paintbrushes to use versus just grabbing the first one that comes to mind. So, well, with that, guys, thank Greg again,
Thank you,
and we
Greg.
will
Thank you.
big thumbs up from all of us.
Thank you for watching this Coast Division EClinic. More Coast EClinics can be found on the Coast Division YouTube channel.